to Prolespod.
Welcome to part 6 of the Stalin Eras, the final episode of our series on the life and times of Joseph Stalin. This is your faithful co-host, Ray. In this episode, we'll be sharing some of our concluding thoughts, some of our reflections that we have come across, that we have uncovered within ourselves as we put together this, if we may be so bold, monumental series, as well as what's coming next for us at Prolespod, which you probably won't want to miss. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at Prolespod and on TikTok at Proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/Prolespod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. Also, some good news for once in your life. We will now be doing monthly Vanguard drawings for a Proles pack. This will be a mystery box of sorts that may include a postcard from us, some random communist pins, a random coffee table or history book, and a very limited run merch item that we have designed ourselves. And they're fucking awesome.
True.
We will announce the monthly winner in an episode, as well as share a cheeky picture of the box on our Patreon. We will be using these Proles packs as rewards for different contests too, so keep an eye out for those. Which brings us to the announcement of April's Vanguard Proles pack winner, Talking Socks! Congrats to them, and thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon. We really do appreciate every one of you. So before we dive into the final episode of the Stalin Eras, who else is with me today?
So we have Tony here. You're the host of your other favorite socialist podcast, After Existing Socialism.
I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Justin. And with our powers combined,
We're Prolespod.
Okay.
We're trying new things. This is bad.
All right. So
We'll never try new things again.
I don't think we
never
should.
try
You know
new
what? I
things
think
ever again.
I'm going to be honest. I think there's like a cutoff date, maybe age-wise, for trying new things, and I think
Probably. Yeah,
we've passed it.
Almost definitely.
Okay. So to kick off our discussion, what are some key takeaways or sort of concluding points that you hope listeners leave the series with? I mean, if they've been listening for this whole thing and they've listened to like 30 hours of Stalin forward content at this point, like, what do you hope people walk away with?
So I guess for my part, the Anna Louise Strong text was very important to sort of understanding on the ground experiences, because obviously she's there right after the revolution. She gets there during the Civil War, and she explains what everything is like for individuals, not just, at the party level. What is the party doing even regionally? We're talking about people who are experiencing the impacts of the decisions made by the party. And also, getting to hear from commissars and getting to hear from peasants and getting to hear from workers, all of the above. That was vital to me. But the thing that kind of surprised me, or that I feel like was most kind of eye-opening there, was when she goes to Germany as the Nazis are sort of ascendant, right? And like, I had always imagined in my mind that the programs which were introduced domestically, obviously very racist, but also the big public works projects, were key in jumpstarting the German economy. What I didn't realize until I read that book was that it was built on slave labor, right? Like it was built upon young Germans being forced to build military highways. And it was built upon taking the unemployed and taking their money away and giving it to landlords in the East so that they could then pay a, quote, fair wage to those workers, which is fucked. That's not good domestic policy. That's fucking terrible. So debunking the myth that the Nazis like injected a lot of money into the betterment of their people is really not true. They injected money into the betterment of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I mean, further to Jeremy's point about the importance of getting that on the ground Soviet citizen perspective, it's really important because all of us, for the most part, living in anti-communist societies, we know that they love narrowing what we hear about these socialist countries, what everyday life was like. And if we do hear anything about how everyday life was like, it's going to focus on the things that didn't work, or the things which were harmful in some way, or repressions, or the gulag, or whatever it is. But of course, life in the Soviet Union was a lot more complicated than just the gulag. Having these personal experiences, like the ones that we try to use in this series, were not just, of course, like, public pronouncements of someone's life or an experience that they had, but we included a lot of personal journals. So these were things that were essentially never meant to be published. These were people writing in their own private journals about what life was like. This is very different, for example, when we compare it to defectors like Yeonmi Park, whose narratives are, supported and literally funded by the worst fucking people in existence. And so it's very, very key that we get these varying perspectives. You'll find it's funny because when it comes to, let's say, Jim Crow or settler colonialism, imperialism, in the societies that we live in, we'll often hear the positive aspects of those. Like we'll see maybe some 1950s family, leave it to Beaver, whatever it is, right? Where it's like these concerns or the realities of what life was like is totally erased when it comes to the experience of marginalized communities, right? And so it's very important that we problematize the narratives of socialist countries that we receive with these narratives of everyday Soviet citizens who, as we've shown in this series, life wasn't always perfect. The Soviet Union, throughout its existence, experienced capitalist encirclement, which meant there were shortages in some areas, that systems didn't always work the way they needed it to work, right? But we're Marxists. We're not here to present a utopian picture of what reality is, but what it's actually existing.
Wow.
I didn't land that. I was building the plane while crashing the plane. But yeah, no, it's just important for us, of course, to know these countries as they actually were. And the remaining socialist countries, Cuba, China, Laos, whatever it is, it's important that we know how they actually are existing now.
Yeah, I mean, materialism, bruh.
Yeah.
So for me, I guess, unsurprisingly, the thing I hope people walk away with is that Stalin was a human being, and that, like this whole irony about like Stalin did nothing wrong, or, the juxtaposition of, Stalin was a monster. I would not say that he did nothing wrong, but I would say that he did nothing with bad intentions, right? He made mistakes, but they were doing things that had never been done before. And they were never like malicious, like, oh my God, what's a great idea? Let's transition these peasants that aren't ready to run farms by themselves over and then have the grain like spoil because they aren't sure what to do with it properly, right? That was a mistake, but it's not like that was the goal. And so I think that that's important. I think it's important to understand that Stalin was like a shitty friend and a shitty dad, but that is because he dedicated every fucking second of his life from his teenage years until his 70s when he died to creating the conditions that he felt and arguably were necessary to improve the lives of everyone in the future, right? He knew that he was not going to create world revolution and utopianize in his lifetime. His goal was to keep the Soviet Union strong and afloat so that it could be that beacon of communism that everyone else could look to and to help kind of push over their own revolutions, and then Khrushchev wanted to monocrop.
Yay. Yay.
Not yet.
I don't know. He was a human being. We were trying to get a hold of the actual document that Dan Healy references in his text where it says that, like, Yagoda sent Stalin this request to make homosexuality illegal in the Soviet Union, and Stalin supposedly was like, oh yeah, this is very important, we need to push this through, these motherfuckers need to go down or whatever. But like, we never actually got a hold of that document. We will continue, I suppose, trying to find it, and once we do, we can analyze it more specifically and find out whether that's bullshit or whether it's exaggerated or whether it is true. And it's possible that it is true, because it is possible that Stalin himself had homophobic values within himself. We don't know.
The man was born in the mid to late 1800s.
Right. So it is possible and even probable that he did. But, this is, he again is a human being, and a
He's
human
flawed.
being of his era in particular.
Right.
It sucks. But
also should be noted that we found the law, which was drafted by two people that were not Stalin.
Right.
So.
Right. Which sort of goes back to the same kind of paradox that we experience all the time. Like, what was it? Was Stalin the great man who knew absolutely everything that was going on all the time and constantly knew everyone else's ideas and was the only opinion that mattered, the only person who could say yes or no about anything? Or was he just this cruel, vicious, bumbling idiot bent on murdering his own people, right? It's just he can only ever be one of those things, and it can't just be actually maybe something wasn't. Right. Again, we don't know, but it's also possible, probable, and incredibly likely that sometimes things just were not a priority. He trusted other people to handle them, whether or not that was the right call.
Right.
It is what it is. And I guess, I don't know, a lot of my takeaways are sort of maybe meta, like ideas that I wish people would understand more about history and politics and the way that we engage with them in general. And the first one, I think, is history is both incredibly complex and also incredibly accessible. And I say this as the person who didn't really know a lot about history, who's now on a history podcast. I became a fan of the show because it's something that I wanted to learn more. And just to remind listeners, if you're listening, we got all kind of feedback from people, including this wasn't in-depth enough, or this was more information that I could have possibly taken in, right? And wherever you fall on that spectrum, just to encourage people, we all have our ways in, we all have our areas of interest. I think Stalin and also just this period of history is very popular for understandable reasons. The ripple effects are still impacting us today in enormous ways, and also in ways that probably most of us don't even notice, right? And so doing a project like this and encountering the way that other people experience it and the way that we as a group have experienced it, it just reminds me again that history is absolutely worth learning. I'll get to this with one of my other takeaways in a second, but it is a non-negotiable. That said, rather than being daunted, and I try to say this all the time, whether we're doing a history episode or a theory episode, rather than being daunted, rather than shutting down, rather than saying you can't, we all have our ways in. Pick one thing that is of interest to you, pick one thing that you can understand, and just go from there. But along with that, and we'll probably talk about this more either here or in the bonus episode, nobody is immune to propaganda. We're all being propagandized to all the time. All of these people have their own agendas, both personal agendas and political agendas, and are not even always aware of exactly what's what, right? And we have to constantly continue practicing to see through that and evaluating things. I don't know, some might call it a material analysis. Look it up. And by the way, that includes discussing things and thinking things through in community with other people. This is one of actually the key takeaways, even watching people, again, the three of you who know so much that I feel constantly astounded to watch the three of you come into the chat and be what do you think about this? What is your read on this? To watch you disagree about it, to watch you agree on things, to watch you say, actually, I read this thing and it conflicts with that. It just reminded me over and over. And obviously the conversations that we had in preparing for the episodes that I also participated in. I swear I say things off mic sometimes, but reminds me of just how vitally important it is to go over your ideas with people. First of all, before you're just publishing them to the world, but second, before you're taking them as your opinion and walking around with them because you read one book or one article, or you just had one general opinion from fucking 8th grade or whatever. Which again, right, I think another thing that is really important is to remind ourselves, I think everybody has mentioned this implicitly, if not explicitly in our takeaways, which is that being a communist communist is not being an idealist, it's being a materialist. I think that's like one of the huge key takeaways, especially when we were going through the episode of the 40s. We talked about this a little bit in the discussion for that era episode. I really struggled when I was like looking at the linear series of events that took place with what I knew about Stalin and what he was writing and what he was saying was important. And there was like in my own analysis at the beginning of the project 100,000 years ago, missing pieces of like, yeah, but you're not comparing. And I think I've said this like throughout the series, right? Like one of the things that I have learned is like, you're not always, when we're looking at history, we cannot always be comparing things to what the best possible outcome was. We can only be comparing them to the other potential outcomes, not an idealized version of one that may or may not have been available in the moment, right? Another key takeaway, I feel like we should just I know we all think this. I am speaking for all of us when I say, to this day, it is impossible to accurately calculate or quantify or understand how incredibly huge the loss of the Soviet Union was for the world. And then the last takeaway I have for anyone listening, whether it's specifically about Stalin Eras or another part of history, you have to read. Like, you guys have to read.
Read a fucking book.
You have to read so many fucking books. I don't know how, but you need to find the time and you need to make the time. We cannot fall victim to anti-intellectualism. Please, like I've said before, do it with others if you can. Listen on audio if it helps. And like, you know, when I do the theory episodes or whatever, like I listen to the audio and I read at the same time so that I can have a more accurate understanding. Again, talk to people with the things that you are taking away from it, seeing if there's things that you're missing, seeing if there's other things. But the reality is like, I think it's so important. Obviously, I think that there's value in our show, right? Like that's why we're here. And there's so much value in all of these other shows that people do. But a political view that is like, founded on a game of telephone of other people's like memories and analysis and ideas. This is not a fully realized political opinion. And you have to keep reading, right? We were by no means, I don't want to oversell it and make it seem like we were way ahead of the game in preparing for our episodes because like we were not. But the release of the Soviet documents, like in the middle of the series, like Justin especially lost his fucking mind trying to sift through all of those things. And it goes to show that like there's always more to learn. And I think about this like one time, unrelated to the Soviet Union, I'm so sorry, but relevant to this idea is like I was in Egypt and like physically while I was in Egypt on a tour of a pyramid with a bunch of like Egyptologists who were leading and explaining about what they thought they knew, there was like a whole new city that was discovered underground. And it really solidified for me something that I just like have not stopped thinking about since, which is that like history works in both directions. And there is just like always more to learn, and the humility and the integrity that it takes to continue to see oneself as a student first. Like, I just think is really, really, really important. And those were sort of like my takeaways.
Yeah. And on those notes, like, you know, I think some of them are connected because you're talking about like when you're doing analysis and when you're doing these readings, it is important to talk to other people about it. And so I think probably, you know, whatever, do yourself a little communist book club if you can, because you may be focused on one particular aspect and you may miss something completely, and somebody else may bring it up and you're like, wait, where did you read that? And you're like in the same thing that you just read. But it's just a matter of like the filter that you have on your mind, you are not aware of it. You will never be aware of it. Well, I mean, you can try, you can be present or whatever in attempt to like
and like, hey, you should try, but you're probably not going to arrive at anything.
And even if you do, like, you're probably still going to fall victim to that bias that you have within your head anyway. So there's that aspect to it. The other is like for that, whatever, a 15, 20-minute segment that I did during the Contradictions and Controversies episode, I read 3 books and 1 paper for that little fucking section. So I necessarily left a lot of shit out because there's no way that I can talk about everything. And some of it is because it isn't necessarily relevant to the specific thing that I'm discussing. But, you know, getting back to the fucking Michel Rolf trio thing, I'm creating silences myself, right? I have a particular thing that I need to get across. I have to do it in a timely fashion. So if you want to understand the bigger picture, you've got to read those sources. You can't just take my word for it, you know, and doubly so when it's something that's like fucking you're getting from an anti-communist, right? You can't just absorb that and be like, oh, well, this guy said this thing and that guy said that thing. Well, where did they get that information from? You know, and sometimes they will reference primary sources that you can't look at, but quite often you can. And that's another thing that I would recommend doing if you're like, I don't know if I agree with this. Go back and find the original source. If you go back to the Ukraine episode, there was a guy who was I forget which author it was. Both of those books were shitty. But the author was like, oh, well, the Bolsheviks had to learn the lesson of 1919, that Ukrainian nationalism was important. And then I was like, well, that's a weird thing to say, because the Bolsheviks were quite, especially under Lenin and Stalin, focused upon the national question and how to address the issue of nationalities and nationalism. So then I had to like dig and dig and dig, and I finally found the source that was being referenced there. And it was a Trotskyist who was at the time in charge of the Bolshevik forces in Ukraine. I want to say it was Preobrazhensky, but I can't remember. Anyway, that guy was the one who, quote, had to learn the lesson of 1919. And he learned it because Lenin wrote him a scathing letter that was like, you can't ignore Ukrainian nationalism here. It is a factor whether we want it to be or not. And so, again, like, people misrepresent things like that all the time in especially public-facing histories, not academic histories. They very often will put that sort of shit in there and assume that the average reader is not going to go back and double-check to make sure that that's actually what the primary source said. But it is, again, important to do that sort of stuff with the help of other people, because you can't do it all yourself. You can't read literally everything that's ever been written. It's not possible. Build a community of people that you trust and try to read together.
And on that note, we strongly encourage finding your community, preferably in person, most important. If that's impossible, then either find an existing community online or reach out to us so that we can create one for people to talk amongst themselves.
Yeah.
So I guess to wrap up our key takeaways here, I'm just going to say that it's important for listeners to understand that mainstream scholarship is not totally incompatible with Marxist-Leninist or socialist views of either the Stalin era or the history of the Soviet Union. So I encourage people to read with a materialist lens and a critical lens, of course, scholars such as J.R. Szkedy, William Chase, Sheila Fitzpatrick, and many, many others who we've cited throughout our series. And you can find that in the show notes for each episode. We list the sources, we list recommended readings, we list recommended listening, so other podcasts that you should check out as well. Of course, this isn't to say that anti-communism is no longer a factor in modern day scholarship, but it is certainly less of a factor than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. The more modern scholarship, it presents a very, complex understanding of the period. It addresses some of the Cold War cliches and Cold War lenses that have been used. They analyze Soviet society at various levels. So not just pronouncements from the center, but looking at things that are happening on a regional level and on a local level. We've already covered, of course, and particularly in part 3, some of the amazing new work that is coming from scholars like William J. Chase to really remove the veil of, I guess, nonsense really surrounding the Moscow trials in the Western world that suggests that they were show trials, that there was no truth to them, et cetera, et cetera. Also, as a result of the latest scholarship, we have a better understanding of Soviet repressions that is actually based on evidence and not just what some emigres said who may or may not have known anything about what he was talking about. So these are all positive things, which is why I encourage people to take a look at this stuff. Of course, there are, negative trends in Soviet history. When you look at particularly the post-Soviet countries, you'll find some still crazy shit. But there's also positive trends as well in those countries. Just the other day, I was looking at recent articles published about collective farms in the 70s, in the 80s, in the Baltic regions. So they met with a whole bunch of people who lived in this particular one and how they loved it. They miss it. It was such a powerful and important part of their lives that they wish they could go back to, right? So these things are being highlighted, which is great.
So this is a question I especially pose to the three of you, because just so everybody knows, obviously, I was the last one to join of all of us. I was the most recent addition to the Proles. And even though they hadn't started recording yet, there was already plans to do the Stalin Eras before I had joined the show. And so I guess my next question is, for people who've been interested in this for a very long time, for people who, especially the legacy Proles, really got your start really on the wider stage of the left podcastariat in your episode on Stalin.
I would say it was the air horns.
Oh. Did anything that you learn about Stalin preparing for these episodes surprise you? Did anything that you learned about air horns surprise you?
I was surprised at how accessible Stalin was to common people. Like, I'd heard anecdotes about, oh, well, he was out walking amongst the people, or Justin had read the story from his bodyguard, I think it was, where he goes to the bus stop and like ferries people around in his fucking car. But that's just one instance. But the sheer number of times that a random ass person wrote him a letter and he wrote them back one-on-one, or like he met with Anna Louise Strong because she wanted to meet with him, or like I got a hold of this. I can't remember if I've referenced this on like an actual episode or not, but I got a hold of this like Soviet art book that includes a painting of Stalin meeting one-on-one with peasants at the Peasant Soviet. Like, I forget what the name of the like central meeting of the Peasant Soviets was, but that is a painting of a real event, which then I was able to look up and go, oh shit, this is like a thing that happened regularly, where he would just go to these events and just sit and talk and chit chat with people to get their perspectives individually. Because, it is one thing to understand from sociological studies what it's like to be in a particular position. You can get a grand idea, but in order to understand how it's impacting people individually, you have to talk to individuals. I suppose that is the difference between sociology and anthropology, right? Like, sociology, the goal is to get a big picture, and anthropology is to get specifics, like get individual interviews with individual people and understand what's happening to them on an individual level rather than socially. And I think that's important because sociological studies by their nature are broad but very shallow, because you can't ask these kind of questions and then generalize them. Whereas anthropological studies tend to be very narrow but very deep. And I think that Stalin was sort of getting that anthropological side of understanding the experiences of the average Soviet citizen. And that was surprising to me how often that happened. It wasn't just a one-off. That was an extremely common occurrence.
I guess, so a lot of things were surprising for me. I came in, I thought, knowing a lot of stuff, and then like my mind just was like exploded during the process of researching and producing this series. I think the most surprising thing for me was how many chances and how much defense Stalin put up personally for the people that were accused of the various things that they would eventually be executed for. I think there is this idea that it was like, obviously faked, but
like off with his head.
Yeah, but like spearheaded by Stalin to eliminate enemies or whatever. But that's not even remotely true. I mean, he was constantly, until he just felt like a complete fucking fool. The Bukharin thing, I think, is the one that sent him over the edge. After that, he stopped, at least in recorded documents, really elucidating a defense of anyone that was accused of anything. But yeah, I just, the number of times that he was like, wait, let's slow down. Let's give this person a chance to defend themselves. Hold on, let's bring them in and talk to them. And I think that was really surprising to me.
So yeah, what surprised me was, prior to this, to doing researching for this series, I was under the impression, slightly embarrassing to say now, but I was under the impression that the Moscow trials, for the most part, were not legit, and that I took the kind of standard view that they were frame-ups to a certain degree. Perhaps some of the people were involved in something, but for the most part, the trials were caused by the both external and internal tensions, which, made Soviet leadership believe that there was something going on here, perhaps blowing it out of proportion. But now I would concede that I was wrong about having that position, and that the Moscow trials, I believe now, were legitimate. And this is based upon having a deeper understanding of the actual charges themselves, the evidence that we know behind those charges, particularly the recent scholarship from William J. Chase, which we've already mentioned on this episode, and we examined in detail in part 3. Things like Trotsky lying about his very close relationship with Valentin Olberg, who we now know is a confirmed Gestapo agent, despite Trotsky and his son and all those around him lying about this in a very deliberate effort to obscure this relation, right? And so that is perhaps, and like I remember, so I feel like in the Prolespod chat that we have, Justin kind of poking me in this direction.
I would never.
Him laughing. You definitely guided me gently, and perhaps not so gently sometimes, in really coming to better understand the reality and the legitimacy of these Moscow trials. And hopefully new scholarship as the years go on is really going to illuminate.
I was just going to say, and I think it will, just with the degree of shit that is being declassified. I mean, I can't fucking access it because of asshole like scholarship nonsense, but they have declassified the entire Stalin archive. Of course, they have not published them on the internet yet. They have published a bunch of other shit, as you obviously know, but I would love to be able to get my hands on that because that's huge.
The other thing that surprised me was understanding all of the components that led to the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That there's a Spanish Civil War, which we covered. There's the undeclared war with Japan in 1939, which played a huge impact in that. And of course, trying to prevent a war with Germany. Molotov-Ribbentrop is presented so flatly in the West as just like literally like, evil rubbing hands together and like cackling. Like Hitler and Stalin are like, yes, we just like
the Stalin-Hitler pact.
Exactly. We're both evil and like we just want to do evil things. So we're going to start this war. But of course, what this presentation of history does is that it obscures the fact that the Soviet Union was really the only anti-fascist country at the time that was fighting the war on behalf of the Second Republic in Spain, providing assistance, military aid.
Yeah, and that is the key, right? Like none of the other nations would provide support to the liberals even in Spain. So what that tells me is that they were not only not anti-fascist, they were pro-fascist, right? Because they were saying, okay, you know what? Here's this liberal, neutral nation, and we would prefer that it falls to fascism than that we get involved against it. And part of it was they were afraid of upsetting the fascist powers, right? But the Soviet Union wasn't. And that means that there was a principled foundation to the Soviet Union, which did not exist in the UK or France or the United States. It was not important enough to them to defeat fascism that they would provide even like material support to the liberals or the socialists or the anarchists or any group of people. It was up to individuals to go and do that on their own if they so chose.
Yeah, which is why it's so fucked up that the portrayal of the Soviet Union as being unprincipled in the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is fucking horseshit.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like we're seeing sort of a theme here with some of the takeaways that you guys have said and one of mine, which is that whether or not it's historically accurate, every single shortcoming that the Soviet Union ever influenced or was a part of or made a decision intentionally to do, like whatever it was, all of the mistakes, even if they didn't even happen at the same time, are blamed on Stalin. Because the one that I was going to say, and again, I mentioned this book, A Sacred Space is Never Empty. I kind of like had internalized that like, oh yeah, they went too far with the anti-religion stuff. And, I'm a spiritually inclined person. I've said this many times. And I was like, oh yeah, they just need to like get over that. That was a mistake. And I think that like a lot of leftists, a lot of communists are like, yeah, a lot of existing states didn't necessarily handle this well. And like, while I can genuinely and generally agree with that, the reality is that those changes didn't happen during Stalin's lifetime, even. The great man, he's actually so great. Again, he's like so bumbling and cruel and evil, but he's like high-fiving Nazis while also fighting a war apparently against them. But also he can like bend space and time to like make mistakes posthumously in the Soviet Union. And I think that was like one of my biggest takeaways that I was going to say is like a lot of the things that I like thought were wrong and still maybe think were wrong, maybe weren't necessarily up to Stalin or associated with Stalin, like in any way.
Yeah, but that wasn't because they were trying to destroy religion. That was because there was undue anti-communist political maneuvering which was taking place within these religions. And the Orthodox Church in particular was more or less synonymous with Tsarism by the time of the revolution. And so...
Right. It wasn't coming from the place that like these are inherently anti-state actors because they are religious. It's like, no, they are anti-state actors because they are anti-state actors.
exactly.
And that's what makes it a problem.
They were motivating peasants against the Soviet government. And that is a problem when you're trying to get the peasants on your side to collectivize in particular.
And which we've said before, that the reality was in the moment on the ground, while there were different kind of class stratifications within peasants, they didn't map neatly onto industrialized workers. And so like the Soviets were kind of grappling with like, how do we, I mean, for decades, right? Like, how do we communicate with them? How do we meet their needs? And so in a certain way, they were sort of like up for grabs because socially as a population, they were just less legible to the Soviets than, again, like the workers.
Yeah, I wish I had like brought it with me, but I read a document a few days ago from 1952, like right before Stalin died, or I guess was too sick to go to work. And he was talking to the East German government and he was discussing like what they were working on, right? So again, the idea of like Moscow dictating everything is silly because he's literally asking them what they're doing. And so they respond like, oh, what are you doing as far as collectivization? And they respond like, well, we haven't really pushed collectivization because we don't want to discount or alienate the idea of a unified Germany because they were still holding to that, right? That was important. And Stalin says, he's like, the West has no intention of allowing a reunified Germany to happen. They will not let it happen. But in the meantime, you're alienating your own peasantry by not allowing them to collectivize. And then he launches into this big thing where he addresses all of the mistakes that they made during the collectivization process so that Germany could avoid that, which I thought was really awesome because he doesn't go in like, oh, check us out, we're the fucking best, right? He's like, we fucked this up, and we fucked this up, don't fuck this up.
Yeah, again, right into this idea of like the mind of this cruel dictator who was just like actively trying to make his country and his party better. You can like him or not like him as a person, like as a personality and like whatever. But again, just like constantly at every turn. And I do think actually, okay, again, this is like total armchair fuck me speculation. But I do think that there are ways in which so many things that we hear about the Soviet Union in general and Stalin specifically are so verifiably and obviously false that I do think in some interesting way, especially for those on the left, rather than leading them to be like, what else might I be wrong about? What else might I have been misled about? People kind of like double down, on the things that, but he still killed a million bajillion people, or he still actively hated gay people and said it all the time, shouting slurs from his office or whatever, right? Like, I think that in some ways there's some kind of like psychological protective mechanism that encourages people to like hold on to things that they think that they know, right? Because so many other things that they have been wrong about. And by the way, I think we are seeing that we still see that today with other actually existing socialist countries. But maybe this allows us to segue into our next question. How has the recording of this project impacted your politics? Has anything changed for you?
I think necessarily, and maybe it's just the fucking insane sharpening of contradictions that is currently happening right now, but I am far more understanding of the shitty context in which people have developed their political and social consciousness regarding the world around them. Okay, so obviously part of what we were doing here with the Stalin Eras is taking shitty myths about Stalin and dispelling them, but also finding actual criticisms to be made of him and the Soviet government and the overall governance of the Soviet Union. And if we can say, look, this was an entity of its time. This was an entity which was shaped by the pressures surrounding it. And the same of Stalin. Stalin was born in a particular era. He came up in a brutal, horrific national situation prior to the revolution. Those things did not go away immediately. You can't just, it's not like where, you imagine this idealist vision of, oh, the revolution has happened. all problems have been solved that were attributed to capitalism or which were attributed to Tsarism. Like, none of that happens after the revolution. It's something that either you have to put pressure on to cause to change, or you must allow it to sort of be developed out of the people by reshaping the world in which they exist. But if that's true of Stalin, and if that's true of the Soviet Union, this is also true of Americans and the United States, right? Or whatever country you're talking about. There are shitty pressures that cause people to develop along particular lines. Now, does that make it okay? No. Again, this is a thing that we talked about when myself and Ray and Tony went on the RevLeft episode. But the point is not to then take on the aspect of these retrograde and backward opinions. The point is to accept that that's where the people are. You know what I mean? Like, the point is not to absorb those things and take them on because that's how you're going to win people over. The point is to get people to the point where they are willing to accept the class aspect of the things you want to change, that the communists, that the Marxist-Leninists want out of the world, to get them to accept that aspect of things and accept that it will probably not be until after the revolution that we can fundamentally alter the mindset of these people, you know, and I think it's a mistake to go the other direction and go, well, this is where the people are. We're going to have to mimic them in the way that they talk, and we're going to have to use slurs, and we're going to have to, whatever, return to traditional values, whatever the fuck that means, in order to win them over. Like, my point is, I guess, that we still do need to sort of meet people where they are and accept the fact that there are going to be motherfuckers who say and do things that we would consider to be unacceptable on a level of, it's hard to like condense this into a simple concluding statement here. The point is class, right? And we need to unite on class in order to change things. And that is going to require accepting people who do not have all the right opinions on everything else, because there aren't enough of us who have all the right opinions to change anything. But that does not mean we need to adopt these bad fucking, like, because there are, obviously, the working class includes trans people, and the working class includes gay people, and the working class includes women. Shockingly, I've seen a lot of weirdos lately be like, well, we need to try to like bring back the 1950s where a single income could pay for a household. You know, women are productive laborers in that they produce babies. And I'm like, where are y'all going with this? Like, this is so fucking weird. It's not even what the Soviets were doing. Like, I don't know. I don't know how to conclude this. I don't know how to wrap this up with a bow. Maybe you can't. Meet people where they are, but do not become them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good conclusion.
In this world, but not of it.
Stop. Stop it.
Yeah.
So for me, my politics, Jesus. I guess the most obvious is that it super strengthened my convictions within Marxism-Leninism, and being able to see all of these debates and documents and policies and all of it, to see how they did it, why they changed it, why they corrected it, all of it, even why the people who, would get executed in the Moscow trials, why they developed their opinions, why they pushed for what they were doing. All of that really just solidified the importance and infallibility of Marxism-Leninism as the way forward, minus the final contradiction, which I addressed in the last episode. Yeah, so I guess that's probably the biggest thing if we're looking for something more interesting than that. I have gone from being frustrated by the fact that we don't give the Soviet Union credit for destroying the Nazis to like wanting to cry and shout and break things about it. I am daily disgusted with how the US flipped on the Soviet Union after they took on this massive responsibility, this massive sacrifice to essentially save the world. And then how the West just fucking flipped on them a few years later is just just to have economic gains, right? Just to maintain their own place in the world. It is absolutely filthy fucking disgusting. And yeah, and I've gone from like, oh, that sucks, to I rage about it.
So in a lot of ways, similar to kind of what Justin was saying, like I feel so angry about education and history. Obviously, like I said, like this is an era that a lot of people kind of know about or think that they know about. It's a lot of like events that people heard of or think that they've heard of or think that they know what they mean. And like even in my little Appalachian public school, like I learned about this, and reflecting back to like even like shout out to like, I don't know, middle school me, looking back and kind of remembering vaguely some of the things that came up in school. And at the time, internalizing the story that I brought with about myself to the show, which is like, I'm not good at history. I don't understand history. But looking back, a lot of it is like something that is so frustrating to me. And I know I've touched on this before, is that so much of history presents itself, like the text itself is presenting itself in a way that suggests that it is not ideological and that it is somehow this like pure recounting of facts. When in fact, I think a lot of what I was, not to like give my like dumbass child self too much credit, but like I think part of what I was reacting to was like, wait a second, that's really weird and like doesn't make any sense, So also obviously like at the time, like the present time of 2025 and in 2024 when we started recording, like the horrific events of the United States, Israel, like so many so-called Israel, so-called United States happening, the violence that continues to be perpetuated against all working people of the world, people who are unable to work, people who are living in essentially wage slavery, people who are living in actual slavery, the destruction of our planet, the violence of subjugated and oppressed and racialized and otherwise marginalized populations. Like we have learned from none of it. And like that is deliberate. And so going through the series, I'm really angry about education. Also, as I've mentioned before, like I'm a teacher, right? And so I think about it not just my time as a student, but also my work as a teacher and how everything from the way that classes are structured, from the orientation of the desks in most schools, like every single thing from the time that kids leave the home is like to indoctrinate you for a worldview that is just predicated on lies and lies and lies and lies. And so, yeah, like Justin was saying, I went from being like, man, that's fucked up, to being like, what the fuck? Why don't you guys understand how fucked up it is? And just feeling incensed by that. Politically, I started out as a Marxist-Leninist eco-socialist. And if you think that there's a contradiction in that, I recommend that you read Hal's work on contradiction because the climate is our primary contradiction. And I ended a Marxist-Leninist eco-socialist. When I am reflecting today on the lessons that we can learn, again, I'm like, read history. You should just fucking read because you should just know things. But in terms of like applying things for us today, I think that it's important to recognize, right, that we're in such a different, in some ways the same, and in some ways such a different and such a more escalated political moment, as well as something that I have been reflecting on a lot, something I have been talking about a lot on this series, which is people's expectations and their relationship to the state and what they believe their social contract is, as well as like what is actually the social contract, which is much, much worse, but you may or may not be aware of it if it is like the water that you swim in. And so when I reflect on like the things that we can learn from the Soviets, I do think that most of our lessons, if I may say, revolve around using the Soviet example as an example of revolution and not necessarily lessons on statecraft, if that makes sense. Like, I do think that it's worth noting that when I asked, like, when somebody, a patron, I think, asked, like, which actually existing socialist project would we want to live in, none of us said the USSR. And so I think that there are expectations that we have in our modern consciousness that are different. That said, I mean, like, maybe this sounds doomer of me, but I don't know that we're that far off from material conditions. Like if things get much and much and much worse, that a lot of people might be like, hey, whatever, like I'll take it. I'm open to certain ways of conceiving of myself as a citizen that I wasn't before, because it's like this or we're all going to die, I don't know, maybe. And so I think that politically, a lot of like my tendencies have stayed the same, but it's more been about engaging with this and like looking at the lessons of like, okay, but what, if you're not a history nerd, if you're not somebody for whom this material is readily like interesting or accessible, like what are the key pieces of information that we can take from this? I also think, as I'm just saying this out loud, I didn't really plan to say this. I do think that, I think you guys mentioned this too, that there is, even though it has evolved a lot and things arise from their material context, there is a lot that we can learn about certain social initiatives, as much as I've like ragged on them throughout the series and said that I think one of the biggest failures during the Stalin eras was like not always being able to understand certain groups of people, whether they were women, whether they were indigenous people and their relationship to their land and ecology, whether they were religious groups or whatever it was. I don't think that the analysis was always there, but kind of like what you were saying, I think earlier, Jeremy, is like this was the first group of people who was making an effort to make this legible at all. And something that we've been talking about throughout is like a lot of the shortcomings or limitations of the Soviets is and are the inherent shortcomings and limitations of the state. And like, we just need to remember once again that that is the argument for communism, not the argument for capitalism. That is the argument that we need to continue to progress past the state.
Yeah. And I think, so to kind of bring it back to something that you talked about twice, reading. In that note, I think it's important for people to recognize, like, if you are listening to this, you are part of the vanguard. And because we need people that are Marxist-Leninist to be the vanguard. It's never going to be the majority, right? That's not the idea of the vanguard. But if you're listening to this, you're part of the vanguard and you need to conduct yourself as such. And if you aren't willing to conduct yourself as such, then this for you is probably an assuasion of guilt or something along that lines, some sort of a self-serving device to make yourself feel better about your lack of input or whatever. Yeah, and I just think that that's something that is really important for everyone to recognize. If you are going to be a Marxist-Leninist, there are not enough of us, and you need to dedicate yourself to that.
Like Ray, who started before embarking on this project as a Marxist-Leninist, unlike Ray, I'm now a card-carrying Democrat, despite living in Canada. Surprise. It's crazy.
Tony joined the Democratic Party from overseas.
Canada.
And by overseas, I mean from Canada.
He took my spot. I was like, I'm not using it. You can have it.
Yeah.
My +1 to the Democratic Party.
In all seriousness,
hat.
though, I definitely was further radicalized by this process due to reading about, experiencing, and uncovering the lies and the false consciousness surrounding history. And like the irony, of course, is that all this stuff was exposed to me not by Marxist-Leninists in particular or mostly, but by mainstream liberal scholars debunking all these popular understandings of Soviet history. And in the comments for some of the episodes we've done, there have been people who said, why is this important? Why are you guys spending so much time, about 25 hours of recorded time, talking about the Stalin eras, right? And the reason is because anti-communist history is a powerful weapon of the capitalist class. There is an important place and importance for this education. And to be critical of the way that history is produced and reproduced, right? Because it's like, think about growing up. The things that influenced my understanding of the Soviet Union: Animal Farm, a complete work of fiction by a dude who worked for the MI6 at some point, George Orwell, or Big Brother by Orwell as well. Outside, if you look at the other Stalin podcasts, what you'll see as a common source between all of them is Robert Conquest is cited as a main source. And as we covered in the intro episode, Robert Conquest, again, he was a secret MI6 agent while he was producing the material which was against the Soviet Union. So further radicalized for sure, in kind of this negative sense of understanding the work that needs to be done in terms of exposing the myths and the false consciousness surrounding history. On a more positive note, I've become radicalized in the sense that I do feel more encouraged that a better world is possible. By looking at the example of the Soviet Union, as we've covered, not perfect, but in terms of things, say, abortion rights, anti-racism, social services, democracy, feminism, equality, freedom, they were leaps and bounds ahead of the West, right? And this is a process which, of course, we saw in the Soviet Union, which is unfortunately no longer with us, but it's a process that's happening today in current day socialist countries like China, Laos, Cuba. So the future is bright, right? Socialism is an inevitability. So we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and I think just to tack on why we did this, we will not, I firmly believe this, we will not have a socialist revolution if we cannot properly contextualize and appreciate and criticize the Soviet Union during the Stalin eras. Because it doesn't matter whether, you're the caricature of Stalin that the West portrays, or if you're fucking young Gorby, whenever you try to even talk about socialism, it will always go back to Stalin. Oh, well, yes, that's liberalizing, but blah, 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 and then Stalin killed 1 million people.
Right. Yeah.
10 bajillion people, whatever. And so like that is, we have to do that. We have to.
And it doesn't matter whether you are a Marxist-Leninist or a fucking anarchist. If you say I support socialism or I want socialism, then the thing that anti-communists are going to do, the thing that liberals are going to do is say, well, what about the Soviet Union or whatever? And it's you even if you disagree with the overall goals of the Soviet Union or the application of theory within the Soviet Union, you still need to understand on a fundamental level what happened and what didn't happen, what they were trying to do and what they accomplished, what they failed at. All of these different things you need to know because you're going to have to argue with these people with well-sourced, like documented evidence, because they are coming from nowhere. Mm-hmm. They've got nothing. They are saying stuff that they've heard repeated over and over and over. And if you can go, well, no, that didn't happen. This happened. And there are reasons to criticize the Soviet Union because of X, Y, and Z. But those things are not the same as Stalin killed 80 bajillion people. Or that socialism inherently is a vehicle for power-hungry monsters. That's capitalism, my dog. Like, that is capitalism. Yes, of course, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union, the bureaucrats there lived much better lives than the workers. But one, that was not always the case. And two, again, the highest paid people in the Soviet Union were not the bureaucrats. It was the artists and the artisans, the engineers and the scientists. And that's because those people were being stolen by the West. They were being offered a much better life. And so in order to keep them, it wasn't because they were secretly capitalist or state capitalist or whatever the fuck people say about the Soviet Union. Nonsense. It's because of the material conditions they found themselves in. They had to back away from the values, the ideals of socialism in order to succeed and remain and not be destroyed. That's the stuff you've got to understand. You cannot just allow people to regurgitate nonsense, even if you disagree with the Soviet Union on a fundamental level. That is still the example of socialism that everyone is going to point back to. And if you don't understand how socialism worked and how it didn't work in the Soviet Union, then you cannot even argue your own ideology. You've got to defeat that first. And once you defeat that, then you can start talking about what you want instead.
I also think about, I don't know, maybe you guys are also like this. Please tell me. Are you the kind of people that like you hear something, you see something going around, or you're just like interested in something and you're like, where did this come from? And then you like have to dedicate like several weeks of your life to figuring out where things come from. I'm very this person.
Yeah.
And
it's called ADHD.
That's how I ended up watching 42 lectures on the Black Plague.
I have tried to be really fair throughout this series because a
little too fair.
I don't want to upset people. But the Trotsky Wreckerism is alive and well today, right?
It is,
and I would say at this point, not primarily with those who would identify even as Trots, and a lot of folks who've probably never read his work, and a lot of people who would say that they don't identify with any conceptualization of the state or a party or a tendency at all. A lot of them are racialized, marginalized people who are like rightfully very afraid of concentrated state violence and rightfully very against their understandings of perceptions and concentrated state violence. But when I spend time with people in these spaces, the number of times I have to say, hey, there might be an application of XYZ concept. Hey, maybe we'll talk more about it in the bonus episode. What do you guys think? But saying, hey, there's a time and a place, or this idea might have a social application, or this idea might have an application in a different, but as politics, this is Wreckerism. And this has a long history of Wreckerism that goes back to some random fucking white guy. So, sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. I've tried to be really chill and cool about it.
You said the fucking word. I was cool. I hadn't mentioned Trotsky at all.
I through this whole series, I have been trying to be like, listen, guys, I'm not trying to play into that, but like.
But also.
And I went in with an open mind when I read so much Trotsky.
The real sacrifices were made when Ray had to read a bunch of Trotsky.
That's
so much Trotsky. And then rather than just like ranting about it for hours, I just picked like 3 quotes and I was like, we're just going to start here. I'm going to critique these things and I'm just going to move on with my life. And like, yeah. So if you have an idea that counteracts Marx-Leninism, I'm not saying that there's even one Marx-Lenin, like we're all different, right? And we all have slightly different nuances and perceptions and maybe different analyses and different experiences and all of these different things. And like, that is just true, right? We just among us have different opinions on different things. And like, that's fine, but if you're way outside of that and you're still like, I'm definitely a communist, you need to examine those critiques. Again, even if you thought that you had them independently, even if you thought that they came from, so you need to look at those critiques and see where they came from and see how they have been historically applied over the last several decades. And then
whether the U.S. State Department funded them.
I didn't say it. I did not say it.
So what's next for Prolespod or the Stalin Eras? Are we going to jump right into another kind of mega series like this? The answer to that question, yes, is no.
No.
We're definitely not. So I wouldn't expect anything in 2025, but in the future, of course, we do hope to do some sort of series, maybe not an eras type thing, but another kind of research-heavy narrative, including series in the future. We don't have a set topic on that, so you just kind of have to wait and see.
But we've had many requests.
Many.
I do want to say to listeners, though, I invite you all to really think about truly, like I'm not being funny, like the Marxist concept of primitive accumulation. We are a group of people that have this interest, and especially the 3 of you who have had this interest for many, many, many years, and we're like slowly kind of learning and gaining sources and developing access and connections and different ways in. And that takes a tremendously long time. And so even though just looking at the series itself, having taken months and months, is like, that's not true. Actually, the production, the pre-production, the research started years ago. And that's going to be true for any series. And so as a listener, if you're not used to what goes at the back end of something like a show that's like this or a project that's like this, you really do have to think about it in terms of almost like a primitive accumulation before what we consider like the industrial production or like the podcast episodes themselves. So really keep in mind that if we're starting again from scratch or close to it, we don't really have the wealth of information at our disposal in order to put something together. So please like be patient and show us.
So if you do want to see us do another series like this in the future, of course, what you can do is support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/Prolespod. Of course, we'll be...
You can support AES too, because at this point, we're charging Tony to run ads in our show.
Damn.
You guys are hilarious. But anyways...
Let me interject here. The reason that this is so important is because our goal, our vision, as we say every intro, is that we can expand the scope of this project to cover a lot of different things, kind of to be a almost multimedia hub of Marxism-Leninism. And we cannot do that if we are slave laboring at shitty jobs. And so we really need to become financially independent as a result of this project. In order to do that, I don't know if it's going to be possible or not, but that is the goal. And so we need your help in getting there.
Yeah, I mean, it may not. We may never get to the point where we can't work. Maybe we can get to the part where we can work part-time. I mean, I don't really know. But all of us have full-time jobs and some of us have children, and that makes this project difficult because it leaves us basically evenings and weekends, which we then are taking away from our families and our free time.
Stalining.
And yeah, we're Stalin. We're bad parents.
And also, by the way, not even just weekends, because like I have 2 jobs.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean,
I don't even always have weekends.
Right. So it's rough out here for a communist. And, obviously we're not asking you to like stretch your family's finances to the point where you're going to harm yourself if you're doing it. Obviously we don't want that.
The less time we have to work, the more time we can dedicate to this.
Right. And we've talked about a lot of different things that we want to do, but we really are trying to be better to ourselves this go around than we were during the initial run of Proles, where it was literally every weekend was taken up by something related to Proles. Like we were recording a main episode or a bonus episode or an RPG session, or it was creating some kind of bonus content, or it was putting together care packages to send out because we initially had really bad really extra Patreon perks that required us to mail a bunch of shit. And that was another thing that took up a bunch of time. But anyway, I guess my point is, I don't know. We love you. Please love us back.
Yes.
Yeah, so you guys can expect from us to be expanding the types of episodes that we do produce. So, of course, we'll be doing kind of like the regular style of Prolespod episode you're used to, but also expanding the topics that we cover. So there'll be more culture episodes. There'll be potentially episodes focused on books. There'll be episodes that are more lighthearted. There'll be episodes that are more research heavy. So we're kind of moving into the post-Stalin eras for the Prolespod here. It's not going to be the Khrushchev eras, right? It's going to be something better. So, yeah, with less corn.
Yeah.
That about does it for the final episode of the Stalin Eras. We want to thank all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Girl Boss Woman, Matthias S., Kenzie W., Sonia B., Dennis H., Moy Toastman, Bill T., Kenneth G., Callum F., Infestadec, Claudia, Kirsten M., Ryan T., Goth Holiday, Stokely D., JSA, Jack S., Casey D., Atchit P., Tanner M., and Tito's Iron Fist. And a special shout out to our Vanguard subscribers, Better Red Than Liberal, Little Lumpen Prol, The Winking Cossack, and B. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have any questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets and solidarity forever.
Send
Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.